Government 2305, Federal Government. Lesson 3, Federalism. Forging a New Nation. After completing this lesson, you will be able to describe the U.S. federal system, demonstrate knowledge of the distribution of federal versus state powers, summarize the evolution of the U.S. federal system, compare state constitutions with the U.S. Constitution, describe sources of revenue for state and local governments, analyze the benefits and drawbacks of U.S. federalism today, and explain public opinion's influence on setting the boundaries between federal and state power. The relationship between the states and the nation was the most contentious issue when the Constitution was written, and has remained so to this day. One such dispute, the Civil War, nearly tore the country apart. This chapter examines federalism, its creation through the Constitution, its evolution during the nation's history, and its current status. The chapter's main points are as follows. The power of government must be equal to its responsibilities. The Constitution was needed because the nation's preceding system, under the Articles of Confederation, was too weak to accomplish its expected goals, particularly those of a strong defense and an integrated economy. Federalism, the Constitution's division of governing authority between two levels, nation and states, was the result of political bargaining. Federalism was not a theoretical principle, but rather a compromise made necessary in 1787 by the prior existence of the states. Federalism is not a fixed principle for allocating power between the national and state governments, but rather a principle that has changed over time in response to political needs and partisan ideology. Federalism has passed through several distinct stages in the course of the nation's history that have shifted power from the states to the national government. Federal grants to state and local governments are a defining feature of contemporary federalism and have enabled the federal government to exert influence in policy areas traditionally controlled by the states. Although these grants have become a permanent feature of federalism, the scale of the spending and the purpose of the grants are sources of partisan conflict. One of the most important areas of concern to the founders was that of sovereignty, which is defined as supreme and final governing authority. The founders had three basic models of sovereignty to consider. The first was the unitary system, in which the national government is sovereign, and states have little if any power to make or enforce their own laws. This was the type of government that the founders were rejecting when they decided to revolt against the king in Britain. The second is a confederacy where the states alone are sovereign, and the national government has little if any power or authority. This was the type of government that was established under the Articles of Confederation, and it quickly became evident that this form of government would not work if we were to be a true United States. So the founders opted for a third, much more controversial form of government that was described as federalism. Under this form of government, sovereignty is shared by both the national government and the states. But this is also the most difficult form of government to institute, as it requires a truly cooperative balance and sharing of power and authority between the states and the national government. For this form of government to work was truly an arduous and almost impossible task for the founders to undertake, and it would also create a great deal of risk should it fail. The founders knew that there were evident problems with having a national government that was too weak. These included public disorder, economic chaos, and an inadequate national defense. The new federal system would divide power among national and state levels and would do a better job in both protecting liberty and moderating the power of government. America's national government has enumerated powers, which are designed primarily to enable it to provide for the nation's defense and commerce. The Supremacy Clause defines the national laws as the supreme laws of the land. The national government also has implied powers through the Necessary and Proper Clause, which gives it the flexibility and responsiveness to meet changing national needs. The states' powers are called reserved powers and are provided through the 10th Amendment, which states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states. At first, the national government was greatly constrained by acts of Congress and pressure from the states. But, as the Supreme Court became more actively involved, and national lawmakers realized they needed to exert new powers in order to enforce their expressly authorized powers, both the Supremacy Clause and the Elastic Clause were used and upheld much more often, leading to the gradual shift in power from the states to the national government, which is known as nationalization. The American federal system divides sovereignty between a national government and the state governments. Each is constitutionally protected in its existence and authority, although their powers overlap somewhat even in areas granted to one level. For example, the federal government has a role in education policy. We can see on this Venn diagram that expressed national powers include national defense, the power to mint and regulate currency, the power to institute and operate the postal system, exclusive sovereignty over foreign affairs, and the power to regulate interstate commerce. The powers given to the states include chartering local governments, instituting and regulating systems of public and higher education, public safety, otherwise known as police powers, registering voters and conducting elections, and regulating interstate commerce, which is commerce that takes place only within that state. The powers that are shared between the national government and the states, also known as concurrent powers, include the power to lend and borrow money, the power to tax, law enforcement authority, the power to institute and charter banks, and the power to regulate transportation such as roads, bridges, and public transportation systems. For over 200 years, federalism has been a contentious issue in the United States. The Constitution established two levels of power, the national government and the state governments, leading to ongoing disputes over jurisdiction. One reason for these conflicts is that the Constitution does not clearly define which level of government should regulate matters such as interstate commerce. Throughout history, federalism has evolved to meet the changing needs of the country and the interests of various groups. There have been three distinct eras of federalism, each characterized by a different dynamic between the national government and the states. In each era, the national government has gained more power than it previously had. Despite its challenges, federalism remains a fundamental aspect of the American political system. It allows for a balance of power between the national government and the states, ensuring that neither entity becomes too dominant. This division of power helps protect individual rights and prevents the concentration of authority in one central body. The evolution of federalism reflects the ever-changing nature of American society. As the country has grown and faced new challenges, the relationship between the national government and the states has adapted accordingly. This flexibility has allowed for the development of policies and laws that address the diverse needs and concerns of the American people and has slowly but progressively left us with a national government that is stronger than it was before. During the first era of America, from 1789 to 1865, the main problem was keeping the country together. Before the Constitution, each state had more power and didn't always agree with what the national government wanted to do. One big argument happened when Alexander Hamilton suggested making a national bank, but Thomas Jefferson disagreed. Hamilton's argument won, and in 1791 Congress made the first Bank of the United States. In 1819, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the national government in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, stating that the national government had powers beyond what is written down in the Constitution. The decision in the McCulloch case became an example for future court rulings that supported national power. The issue of slavery was causing problems for the Union, as more states wanted to make it illegal. South Carolina disagreed with a national law in 1832, showing the seriousness of the issue of states' rights. In 1857, the Supreme Court made the Dred Scott decision, angering people in the North and causing problems in the Democratic Party. Abraham Lincoln's election as president led to the secession of Southern states and the start of the Civil War. The war was very deadly, with over 618,000 deaths, and ended with the Union Army using force to settle the question of national government power over the states, with the issue being settled in favor of national authority. After the North won the Civil War, the country faced new challenges in how the government should work. In the past, certain things were controlled by the national government, while others were left up to the individual states. However, as America changed with the freeing of enslaved black people and increased trade between states, people began questioning if this system, called dual federalism, was still the best way to govern. The Supreme Court repeatedly stated that there was a clear line between what the national government and the states could do. Another issue arose during the Industrial Revolution when big businesses became powerful and mistreated workers. People believed the government should intervene, but the Supreme Court ruled that neither the national government nor the states had control over these businesses. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution to protect formerly enslaved black people from unfair treatment by state governments. It ensured that everyone should be treated equally under the law and have certain rights and privileges. However, the the Supreme Court made decisions that went against the promise of equal justice in the 14th Amendment. In 1873, they said that states could decide the rights of their residents, even though the amendment was meant to limit that power. Then, in 1896, the court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that segregation was acceptable as long as facilities were equal. This ruling allowed the South to treat Black Americans unfairly, leading to separate schools and hospitals with fewer resources for Black individuals. It took 60 years before the Supreme Court reversed this decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, stating that separate facilities were not equal and that states couldn't discriminate based on race. In dual federalism, also known as layer cake federalism, the federal government and the state governments each have their own powers and responsibilities. They can't interfere with each other's business. This is different from cooperative federalism, or marble cake federalism, where the federal and state governments work together on many things. The Constitution is the main source that explains how federalism works. It sets out the powers of the federal government and the states. The federal government is in charge of things like foreign policy and national defense, while the states have their own powers too. After the Civil War, the Supreme Court gave businesses a lot of freedom. They believed in laissez-faire capitalism, which means that businesses should be able to do what they want without interference. The court also interpreted the Constitution in a way that limited the government's ability to regulate business activity. In 1886, they decided that corporations were persons and couldn't be heavily regulated by the states. This meant that a constitutional amendment meant to protect former enslaved people was used to protect businesses instead. The court also made it difficult for the national government to regulate businesses by interpreting the Commerce Clause narrowly. This clause says that Congress can regulate commerce between states, but it doesn't specify what kinds of economic activities are included. When the federal government tried to break up a monopoly on sugar manufacturing, the court said that manufacturing was part of interstate commerce and only subject to state regulation. However, the states were limited in their regulatory powers by the 14th Amendment, so they couldn't do much to regulate manufacturing either. Despite some rules being eventually allowed, the court made it hard to stop bad business practices. For example, in the Hammer v. Dagenhart case in 1918, a law that aimed to prevent kids from working too much for little pay and sending goods across states was deemed unconstitutional. The court stated that only states, not the government, could make rules about factories. In another case, Lochner v. New York in 1905, the court ruled that states couldn't make rules about how long people could work because it went against factory owners' rights. Essentially, the court prevented people from making rules about businesses and gave all the power to big companies. During the Great Depression, many people lost their jobs and the government had to step in to help. The Democratic Party, supported by working-class people, wanted more regulation of businesses and better rights for workers. On the other hand, most Republicans believed in unregulated markets. Republican President Herbert Hoover didn't want to use government power to help people because he thought the economy would fix itself. However, voters elected Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt as president in 1932 because they wanted the government to do more to help. Roosevelt understood that the economy affected everyone, from urban workers to farmers. By the height of the Depression, a fourth of the nation's workers were jobless. States were supposed to help the poor, but they didn't have enough money. Roosevelt's New Deal programs were meant to make things easier for people, but some accused him of being socialist. The Supreme Court also didn't like one of his programs and said it was unconstitutional. In 1937, President Roosevelt was frustrated with the decisions made by the court. He wanted to change the number of Supreme Court justices, so he asked Congress to let him choose a new justice whenever one turned 70.5 years old. Congress said no, but Justice Owen Roberts changed his mind and started supporting the president's plans. This gave Roosevelt a majority on the court. After a few months, the court agreed with a law that gave workers the right to join together and talk with their employers about their working conditions. The court believed that arguments between workers and bosses could hurt the country's economy, so they said that Congress could control this through its power to regulate business. The court also recognized that businesses are not limited to one state and should be regulated by the whole country. For example, the banking industry was saved from falling apart in the 1930s because of a federal agency called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. In the 1930s, the Supreme Court changed its rules about how much power Congress has to tax and spend. In a case called United States versus Butler, the court said that Congress can use its taxing and spending power as long as it is for the good of the whole country. This means that Congress can spend money on many different things, even things that are usually controlled by the states. These changes in the court's decisions allowed the government to take more action during the Great Depression and implement programs to help the American people. After the 1930s, relations between the nation and the states changed so fully that dual federalism was no longer an accurate description of the American system. The national government now operates in many policy areas that were once almost exclusively within the control of states and localities. A more recent development, known as devolution, describes attempts to pass down authority to the state and local levels in certain areas of the country. This trend peaked under the Reagan administration in the 1990s, but has still been a very popular choice among many conservative Republican and libertarian lawmakers. In America, policymakers from different levels of government work together to solve problems. This is known as cooperative federalism, which is a departure from the old way of doing things called dual federalism. Dual federalism was like a layer cake with separate levels, while cooperative federalism is more like a marble cake where the levels flow together. An example of this is the Medicaid program, which helps provide health care for poor people. Both the national and state governments contribute funds to support it, but states have some power in deciding who receives it. It's important to note that cooperative federalism doesn't mean that states are powerless. They still retain control over important areas such as education, public safety, and roads. For instance, states determine the length of the school year and establish requirements for teachers. States have the ability to implement their own policies because they possess the power to make independent decisions. This leads to variations in policies across different states. For example, some states choose not to tax personal income, while others, like California, impose high taxes on individuals earning over $1 million annually. These policy choices directly impact how much money states allocate towards important areas such as education and infrastructure. Additionally, states have the freedom to experiment with new ideas, such as legalizing marijuana or modifying welfare programs. If these ideas prove successful, other states may adopt similar approaches. In some cases, these state-level innovations even prompt changes in federal laws. Chief Justice Louis Brandeis once referred to these state-level innovations and policies as laboratories of democracy, and many who favor states' rights over federal control still use this argument today. But it's important to note that when states accept funding from the federal government, they must adhere to specific rules and priorities established by the national government. For this reason, many states have chosen not to participate in what they call carrot and stick programs. Overall, cooperative federalism allows for collaboration between different levels of government in addressing societal challenges. It promotes a more integrated approach compared to the previous system of dual federalism. While states maintain significant decision-making power, they also benefit from the opportunity to learn from one another and potentially influence federal policies. This dynamic relationship between the national and state governments ensures a balance of authority and fosters innovation at both levels. By working together, policymakers can effectively address the diverse needs and preferences of the American people. Starting in the 1930s, Democratic lawmakers began increasing the federal government's involvement in domestic policies. Initially, these policies were supported by the public, but by the 1960s, many felt they were too costly and bureaucratic. Republicans also opposed these policies, as they advocated for lower taxes and greater control for local governments. In 1972, President Nixon introduced revenue sharing, a program that allowed states and local governments to have more control over how federal money was used. When President Reagan took office in 1981, he aimed to reduce the federal government's role in areas traditionally managed by the states, believing it would safeguard our political freedoms. Despite facing a Democratic-controlled Congress, Reagan managed to slow down the expansion of federal grants and grant states more autonomy in spending. In 1994, when Republicans gained control of Congress, their focus shifted towards transferring power from the federal government to state and local governments. This policy shift was called devolution. The most significant policy change came with the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Many Americans believed that the government was spending excessive amounts on welfare and that too many individuals were taking advantage of the system. The Welfare Reform Act addressed these concerns by implementing stricter eligibility rules and reducing the amount of money allocated. A crucial aspect of this law was the establishment of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TNF, block grant. This replaced the previous cash assistance program, which provided aid to impoverished families with children indefinitely. Under TNF, families can only receive federal assistance for a maximum of 5 years, and each state has the authority to determine the level of support provided. Additionally, TNF allocates funds to states for the creation of training programs aimed at helping individuals secure employment and transition off welfare. Federal assistance accounts for roughly a fifth of state revenue, but the variation is considerable. Montana, which gets 29.2% of its revenue from the federal government, is at one extreme. Virginia, at 13.5%, is at the other extreme. What might explain why some states rely more heavily on federal grants than other states? Your text points out that many federal grants are designed to assist low-income people, and states with higher poverty rates tend to rely more heavily on federal grants. States with a small population relative to their geographical size also rely more heavily on grants as a result, for example, of their highway and rural development needs. There are three main types of federal funding: block grants, federal grants and aid, and categorical grants. Block grants are grants and aid given by the federal government to smaller regional government bodies. These grants provide flexibility to the recipient governments in designing and implementing programs. For example, a block grant for Medicaid would give each state a set amount of money to support healthcare services. However, if a state spends more than the set amount, they have to fill the funding gap themselves. Categorical grants, also known as conditional grants, are grants issued by Congress for specific purposes, such as education or roads. These grants come with rules and guidelines that limit how the funds can be used. An example of a categorical grant is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC, which provides nutrition assistance. Federal grants and aid programs, also called project grants, have evolved over time. They have become an important part of fiscal federalism, where the national government influences state governments by providing financial assistance. These grants can help states meet public needs, but they also come with regulations and requirements that states must follow to receive the funds. Starting in the 1930s, Democratic lawmakers began increasing the federal government's involvement in domestic policies. Initially, these policies were supported by the public, but by the 1960s, many felt they were too costly and bureaucratic. Republicans also opposed these policies, as they advocated for lower taxes and greater control for local governments. In 1972, President Nixon introduced revenue sharing, a program that allowed states and local governments to have more control over how federal money was used. When President Reagan took office in 1981, he aimed to reduce the federal government's role in areas traditionally managed by the states, believing it would safeguard our political freedoms. Despite facing a Democratic-controlled Congress, Reagan managed to slow down the expansion of federal grants and grant states more autonomy in spending. In 1994, when Republicans gained control of Congress, their focus shifted towards transferring power from the federal government to state and local governments. This policy shift was called devolution. The most significant policy change came with the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Many Americans believed that the government was spending excessive amounts on welfare and that too many individuals were taking advantage of the system. The Welfare Reform Act addressed these concerns by implementing stricter eligibility rules and reducing the amount of money allocated. A crucial aspect of this law was the establishment of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TNF, block grant. This replaced the previous cash assistance program, which provided aid to impoverished families with children indefinitely. Under TNF, families can only receive federal assistance for a maximum of 5 years, and each state has the authority to determine the level of support provided. Additionally, TNF allocates funds to states for the creation of training programs aimed at helping individuals secure employment and transition off welfare. The Republican and Democratic parties have long held differing views on the power of the federal government. These differences have recently grown even larger, with Republicans seeking to reduce federal power while Democrats oppose them at every turn. One notable example of this divide is the Healthcare Reform Act passed by Democrats in 2010, which Republicans have since tried to repeal. It's not just lawmakers who hold contrasting opinions on federal power. A graph included in the document reveals that Republicans are more inclined than Democrats to believe that the federal government possesses excessive authority. This disparity has only widened further following the 2020 election, when the Democratic Party gained control of the presidency. Can you think of an area where Republicans are more likely than Democrats to support increased federal spending? The Republican and Democratic parties have long held differing views on the power of the federal government. These differences have recently grown even larger, with Republicans seeking to reduce federal power while Democrats oppose them at every turn. It's not just lawmakers who hold contrasting opinions on federal power, though. The graphic at the bottom of this slide reveals that Republicans are more inclined than Democrats to believe that the federal government possesses excessive authority. This disparity has only widened further following the 2020 election, when the Democratic Party gained control of the presidency. Can you think of an area where Republicans are more likely than Democrats to support increased federal spending? Throughout American history, public opinion has had a significant impact on the distribution of power between the federal and state governments. During times of crisis, such as the Great Depression, people turned to the federal government for assistance when the states were unable to provide help. President Roosevelt's New Deal programs, which offered jobs and income security, gained popularity because they addressed the needs of the people. Similarly, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were a response to the public's demand for improved government services, resulting in the creation of programs like Medicare and Medicaid. However, public opinion regarding the size and reach of the federal government has fluctuated over time. In the 1990s, polls indicated that many Americans believed the federal government had become too large and intrusive. This sentiment led to policies aimed at devolving power to the states, such as the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. The American people desired a government that was more responsive to their needs and believed that empowering the states would achieve this goal. The role of the people in determining the balance of power between the federal and state governments is deeply rooted in the principles of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution recognized the importance of adapting the distribution of power based on the country's evolving needs. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison even acknowledged that Americans would choose whichever level of government was better equipped to meet their needs. This flexibility has allowed Americans throughout history to find a delicate equilibrium between the federal and state governments, ensuring that the nation's needs are met. Understanding how our communities are governed is crucial for active citizenship. One way to gain insight into local governance is by participating in an internship with your local government. By engaging in such opportunities, you can learn firsthand about the decision-making processes and the ways in which power is distributed between different levels of government. This knowledge empowers individuals to actively participate in shaping their communities and advocating for policies that align with their needs and values. In conclusion, the relationship between the federal and state governments has always been influenced by public opinion. The demands of the people have shaped the development of various government programs and policies throughout history. While opinions on the size and reach of the federal government may vary, the Constitution's flexible framework allows for adjustments to be made based on the changing needs of the nation. By actively engaging in local government and understanding the dynamics of power distribution, individuals can play a vital role in shaping their communities and ensuring that government serves the needs of its citizens. Let's put together what we've learned in Lesson 3 with this brief summary. The American political system is divided between a national government and state governments. Initially, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, which established a union of states. However, recognizing the need for a stronger national government, the U.S. Constitution was created to protect both state and national interests. This resulted in a federal system where power is shared between the two levels of government. The Constitution outlines the general powers of the national government and grants it implied powers through the necessary and proper clause, while the 10th Amendment assigns certain powers to the states. During the period from 1789 to 1865, the nation's survival was uncertain as states sometimes prioritized their own power over that of the national government. It was not until the Civil War that it became clear that the United States was a union of people rather than just states. From 1865 to 1937, federalism meant that certain policy areas were the responsibility of the national government, while others fell under the jurisdiction of the states. This allowed large businesses to operate with minimal government control and enabled states to discriminate against African Americans. Modern federalism as we know it today began in the 1930s. In contemporary times, the federal government plays a crucial role in various areas such as commerce, taxes, spending, civil rights, and civil liberties. This increased involvement is a response to the growing complexity of American society and the interdependence among its citizens. National, state, and local officials now work together in what is known as cooperative federalism to address societal issues. The primary way the national government influences policies is through federal grants provided to states and localities. By accepting these grants, states and localities adhere to the priorities set by the federal government. Since the 1980s, Republicans and Democrats have held differing views on the extent to which the federal government should be involved in areas typically handled by the states. Democrats generally advocate for a larger federal role, while Republicans prefer a smaller one. There have been instances where Democrats, such as with the Affordable Care Act in 2010, have succeeded in expanding federal power. Conversely, Republicans, as seen with the Welfare Reform Act in 1996, have achieved victories in limiting federal influence. Throughout history, the public has played a significant role in shaping the balance of power between the federal government and the states. During the 1930s and 1960s, the federal government gained more authority due to the increased need for government assistance. However, in the 1990s, there was a shift in public sentiment, with people desiring less federal power. As a result, there was a trend of returning power to the states. This ongoing tug-of-war between the federal government and the states reflects the dynamic nature of American governance and the ever-evolving relationship between the two levels of authority.